All right, what is up, guys? VV back with another video. And in today's video, guys, we're going to be getting technical. We're going to be doing some theory crafting. We're going to be doing some brainstorming. And we're just going to kind of be looking into a really cool idea. Talking about, archetype theory, classifying deck types, on a spectrum. Now, first and foremost, I have to give credit where credit is due. I got my idea of this video kind of harping off of what Small Hat Crew did. And guys, if you have not checked out the Small Hat Crew, where have you been, guys? They have been, I think they were one of the very first channels to kind of pop off for One Piece. They were kind of, at least from what I saw, you know how YouTube algorithms are, I have no idea. But this was one of the first channels that I started following when I got into the One Piece TCG back in OP02. So please do yourself a favor and go check these guys out if you have not already. Big fan of their stuff. I always watch their stuff when it comes out. So they did a video, I want to say it was about a month ago at the time of me recording this, talking about which leaders should you play. And you see they did a 1 hour deep dive on this, talking about aggro, control, mid-range, and combo, which leader's right for you. So I'm not going to steal their idea entirely here. I'm going to kind of take the idea that they went with, which is kind of this, political compass style of video, and I'm going to go a different direction with it. And not to say my ideas are better, it's just something that I thought of that I want to take, I felt like I could take this idea that they had, which was a brilliant idea, and I felt like I could take it to the next level. But that's not to take anything away from their video. This is a great one, and y'all should check it out and see how they feel about certain cards and decks and the format and ideas. So, real quick, this is the style, the format they used for their little, their spectrum, right? This is a spectrum. And I had these up because these are kind of the original ideas. Maybe they got some inspiration from as well. I'm not sure. I have no idea. But the idea is this. You have authoritarian versus, it says democratic, but I think it's probably more accurately libertarian. And then conservative versus radical is kind of the... it's on a spectrum, right? Where do you fall on a spectrum? Y'all see what I'm saying? This bottom right one's a little more friendly, left versus right, and then authoritarian versus libertarian. That's kind of the idea. And don't worry, we're not going to get political at all, guys. I'm just saying that's kind of like where this idea comes from. So I'm going to take the graph they used, and I'm going to modify it, and kind of going more off this model where it's like a total, how do I say it? Where it creates, I feel like it creates a more accurate spectrum, if that makes sense. And you guys tell me if something didn't make sense. Y'all know. If y'all have any questions or comments, please put them in the comment section below. Because my main issue was this. I don't see a problem being on a spectrum between aggro and control. But mid-range versus combo, that's where it gets a little shady, right? Because here's the truth of it is I think it should be aggro, mid-range, control. Right, like mid-range should just be directly right here. And the idea that I had, let me guys show you what I had in the works, is, like I said, aggro, mid-range, control, like I have it set up here, and then changing it from simplicity versus complexity. So in other words, let me see, I got this laid out. I'll go back in just a second. This is the way that I have it laid out and that we're going to go over, is how simple is the deck to pilot? For example, Zoro being very much on the simpler sides, it has to do with, let me go back now. When I'm talking about simplicity and complexity, I'm referring to how the leader and characters interact. Y'all see that? That's the main thing I'm talking about. So basically, instead of combos versus mid-range, I prefer the idea of how simple is the deck to pilot versus how complex is the deck to pilot. And then going down here, aggro, mid-range, and control, I do have it laid out that way, but hear me out, guys. Instead of aggro, mid-range, and control, I'd rather make it way more generic in terms as offensive, balanced, and defensive. Okay? So bear with me. Bear with me. I'm going to explain more and more as we go through it. So here it is right here. For the left versus right, I have it, super offensive, so aggro, way over here on the left, right? Y'all see that? And over on the right, we have something more defensive, something more passive, right? Aggressive versus passive, offensive versus defensive, aggressive versus control. And in the middle, this is your mid-range area right here, in between the two. And now from top to bottom, the very top being the most complicated deck to run. When I think of complicated, I think of Rebecca, Sakazuki, you know, decks like that. Even Queen to a lesser extent, and we'll talk about that as we get to it. But that's what I think of when it comes to complexity. Versus simplicity would be something very straightforward like Katakuri. You just kind of play on a curve and you just run your opponent over. You know, Zoro, you just play on a curve and you run your opponent, not even on a curve, you just fill out the board and run your opponent over. Now, real quick, before we get into this, one more thing I want to preface here is, do not be offended where I put the leader. It doesn't have to do with your player skill. This is not measuring player skill, because remember, a good player can play Whitebeard and a bad player can play Whitebeard. It doesn't change the idea of how the leader is interacting with the cards. Okay? All right, so let's go ahead and dive into it. So first, I'm going to go row by row here. So the first deck I want to talk about is Zoro, just your standard aggressive Zoro that fills out the board with lots of one-cost characters. It's a pretty simple deck to pilot, and it's very aggressive. So that's why it's in the bottom left corner all the way down here. And if you guys disagree on any of these, by all means, hit me up in the comment section below and tell me why. I'm not going to argue with you. I'm just going to be like, all right, cool. Now I know what they think. Now, you know, and if enough people think a certain way, then, you know, it's like, okay, well, maybe I need to change my thoughts on it. So y'all tell me if something doesn't line up. And of course, everything is deck specific. So let's talk about this next one very, very clearly. Whitebeard, I have right here. There is a way more aggressive version of Whitebeard that you could drag further over into the offensive area here. But generally speaking, I think Whitebeard builds very close to the center, being not a super complex deck to play, and not a really simple deck to play either, because you need to know when to leave Dawn up for your counters and things like this, which also drags them further over to the right, because, you know, you're going to want to run your Marcos, your more defensive options, maybe even, you know, a few like, what's it called, Tony Choppers if you're running the Straw Hat version, so you get that little one-cost blocker down that could win you the game, things like that. So again, it's not the most complex build or deck to run, that's for sure. It's also not the simplest either. It kind of resides somewhere here in the middle, and it's definitely more on the offensive side, on the aggressive side of things, because how it's on a clock. But it can be geared more defensively. Y'all see what I'm saying? So I'm going to stick with the average right around here. Next up is Doflamingo, Blue Doflamingo. This is I would consider it very much mid-range. It has offensive capability, defensive capability. It has a very solid spread of cost characters. So I have it right in the middle, and then it's a little more complex than it is simple. So I have it right here. King and Magellan are kind of the opposites, I would say, where like King is a little more on the defensive side, and Magellan is actually more on the far left side. And I have that later in the video. I didn't want to add it into this part of the slide, but it is going to be later in the video, where Magellan is a little more aggressive, but King is a little more defensive, a little more passive. But both are kind of more on the simplistic side. Not to say they're super low. They require more skill, or excuse me, they require probably a little more thought process than a super aggro rush deck, but not into the realm of super, you know, control decks like Rebecca, Sakazuki, and Queen, if that makes sense. Okay, so there's where they all line up. Let's go to the next row. Next row, we got Trafalgar Law. This is red-green Trafalgar Law, not red-purple. This is a fairly complex deck if you think about it. The way that the leader action works, you're having to pay 2, you're having to fill up the board, then you're paying 2 to return a character, plop down another character, which might pull up another character and take down another character. It's a lot of Dawn manipulation and management, and it's a very complex deck to play. And this goes around the lines, or along the lines of what I think they meant, like, just to go back a little bit, guys, bear with me. When they were talking about combo, this is kind of what they were talking about, is how, like, Trafalgar Law is. Okay? Just to give you guys a heads up for how the Small Hat Crews had their video laid out. Okay. So I have Trafalgar Law as pretty aggressive. It's not really it can be played defensively. Don't get me wrong. It's not a matter of how you can play any deck however you want to. It has defensive tools in it, but it is very much an aggressive deck that swings very low to the ground and fills up the board and can stand up to attack, play rushers, and all that good stuff. Okay? And also cheating cards into play, you know, with the leader effect and whatnot. So next up is Katakuri. This is a very simple deck to pilot, okay, as far as like just you can just play out on curve and have a good time with it, right? And again, this has nothing to do with player skill. Remember that, guys. We're not talking about player skill. We're talking about the way that the leader is in conjunction with the cards in the deck. It can be piloted very easily, not too much thought required, and it's very much in the middle. It has aggressive triggers and defensive triggers. It has offensive cards and defensive cards. It has a very nice spread of cards from 1 Dawn Searchers all the way up to 10 Dawn Bosses. So I have category right down here. Okay, and none of this is gospel, guys. Things can move up and down a little bit, left and right a little bit. You guys know how it is. It's just on a spectrum, roughly speaking. Okay, so next up is Rebecca. Highly complicated deck to run. Very complicated the way that you know, especially now that we have 4-cost Rebecca. You need to be trashing cards, playing Rebecca, which can pull cards out of your trash, throw them into play, doing extra effects. It's a very high skill ceiling deck based on the way the Dressrosa package is and the way the leader acts. And it is more on the defensive side, but I don't have it far right because it runs very low to the ground. Typically speaking, Luffy is the highest cost card. Some decks run the 10-cost Kuzan, but typically speaking, it runs very low to the ground with Luffy being the biggest card. And I actually wanted to put it closer towards purple. I wanted to put it closer towards offensive, but I couldn't really because the leader cannot even attack. So I did have to put it a little more on the defensive side of things. Okay, and last up on this slide is Queen. Queen is a very defensive deck. It goes way over to the right because of how it's trying to establish and get into the late game, dump its hand so that it can start dropping its big bosses and starting to gain life. So because of that and the way it interacts with life, it's a pretty advanced, you know, leader to run. It's pretty complicated. It's a pretty complex leader to run. But I would not, I personally, some people might disagree with this one. I could see people saying it should be a lot higher. That's fine. But honestly, I piloted the deck for a while to pretty good effect in a local level, just at a local level. And I don't think it's actually as hard as people think. You just line up your top card and you go from there. And yes, there's always room for, you know, to get better and all this. Again, it's not about player skill. It's about how the deck operates. So excellent. Okay, so here's where these guys are. And next. So next up we have Purple Luffy here. Purple Luffy, I think, is a little more on the simple side, but it goes very large. So notice how I have it more on quote-unquote defensive. Remember, offensive versus defensive in this you know, the way I have this set up really has to do with the average cost of creatures in the deck. Remember, this deck doesn't really run many 1- and 2-cost characters if it runs any. It might not even run any. I think it just runs like 4-cost and up, generally speaking. So it's really meant to curve out and go really big. So I have it further over on the defensive or slower side where it swings taller. You see what I'm saying? So offensive swings wide and small, whereas offensive side does that. Defensive side swings taller, right? Like more compact, just a few characters and taller. Okay, so that's why I have this over here, and it's more on the simple side, like I said. Lucci is kind of hard to explain. It's very balanced across its mana cost. It has offensive options, defensive options with blockers and whatnot. And the way the leader effect is, it's very much aggressive. I would consider this a slightly more defensive version, or, you know, I don't know. I would consider it a slightly slower version, let me say it like that, than Eustace Kid is. But I don't know, that people might disagree with that on that, and that's fine. I don't play a lot of Lucci, but I know it's very much a mid-range feeling deck. Okay, next up we have Black Yellow Linlin, my favorite. Of course, this is a extremely complex deck to pilot because of the way you have to be down to 1 life. You have to dedicate 4 Dawn from your turn just to use its effect, trashing a card if you have 1 life or less just to gain a life. On top of that, people, there are two, just like with what we talked about with Whitebeard, and of course with all of these decks, there's probably more than 1 different build, but the general build right now for Black Yellow Linlin goes very late into the game and goes very big, it goes very defensive, similar to Queen. But I would consider it much more complicated, a much more complex deck to pilot than Queen. Because the way Queen is, you know, you completely counter out for the most part as much as you can. And then you get down to, like, you know, maybe 0 cards, or let's just say 1 card in life and 2 cards in hand. Well, that next turn, you can just Yamato to go to 2 cards in life, and you'll have 2 cards in hand still, you know, because you'll draw for the turn, and then you attach a Dawn to your leader and swing and go up to 3. You know, it really can, it's a really beneficial leader effect. It's complicated, but not incredibly so. Whereas Charlotte Linlin is like, okay, do I need to counter out of this? Will I even be able to gain a life next turn and establish board? It's a very complicated leader to run. So I had to include that one, guys. Y'all know that's like that's my baby. This is like one of my main decks for those who don't know. Next up is Purple Green Dofi. Purple Green Dofi is by no means simple, but it's by no means complicated. It's a very average level skill level deck, but it is very defensive. At least the current iterations of the deck, like we're saying. Oh, and that's something I should have mentioned about Black Yellow Linlin. A lot of the current decks are running more on the defensive side, but you can build it a little closer to the middle here and make it a little more tempo, make it a little bit more, how would you say it? A little more, you know, mid-rangey. And if you do build it this way, I do think that it goes down a little bit as well when it comes to complexity, because it just becomes a little more simpler in that regard. So anyway, Purple Green Dofi, though, I have right here currently, because it is extremely defensive, and it's not easy to play, but it's not hard to play. It's just a nice deck to learn, that's for sure. Okay, so that's where those are. And the final, you know, row down here. Let's start off with Anel. I think Anel is actually the dead center of the map, personally. It's not super offensive. It can be, but it's not super defensive. It can be. It can be either or, right? If you need to be defensive, you can rely on your leader's effect to gain life cards when you normally wouldn't be able to. But if you need to be more aggressive, it has a good rush setup with a 7-cost Anel. And some people are even teching in the 4-cost Katakuris right now, the 4-cost rush Katakuri, if you have less life than your opponent. So because of that, it's not super simple to play, because you have to try to stay around 1 life so that you can use your special effects like 200 million volts of Maru. But it's also not overly complex to play either, because you do just kind of beat people down and just go off the power of your cards and your leader effect. So I have this dead center. You guys tell me what y'all think about that one. Next up is Red Purple Luffy. Just like a few other leaders, this one can be built super aggressive way over here in the red, or it can be built more to the far right over here, like where you go 7-cost Kid, 9-cost Whitebeard or Edward Newgate, whatever, and 10-cost Purple Luffy. Like, you can build it very tall, and that's why, and that version I think is technically better, because if you want to go all out aggro, I would still actually recommend going Zoro personally. But I mean, you know, it's not that you can't go Red Purple Luffy. I'm just saying I think when it comes to aggro, I think Zoro is just the king right now. But Red Purple Luffy, you know, getting access to purple, you can have access to the 7-cost Eustace Kid, who can give you plus 1,000 power for the turn. That also goes, you know, from turn 7 to turn, or, you know, your 7 Dawn turn to your 9 Dawn turn, gets you straight to, what's his name, Edward Newgate. You see what I'm saying? So it does, like, build very big. So that's why I have it way over here on the slower side, on the defensive side, but very simple. And because this is a 6K leader, it can be very aggressive simultaneously. So very solid. Next up is Blue-Black Sakazuki. Oh, man. Sakazuki, very complex. I wanted to put this closer to offensive. I know some people are like, what are you talking about? Bear with me. Just listen to my train of logic here. It builds very low to the ground. It has nothing but 4-cost and 5-cost characters, and lower, obviously. Like 4 and 5 cost is kind of where it peaks out and goes lower than that. Then it might run a few 7-cost Borsalinos, maybe a Mihawk, and maybe the 10-cost Kaidos. Right? That's as big as it goes. You know what I mean? Whereas, like, you look at cards like, what's it called here? Katakuri. This is running potentially Yamatos, 8-cost Katakuris, 10-cost Charlotte Linlin, the big mom 10-cost Linlin. So I have Sakazuki as much lower than that, as far like not super defensive. I have it right here because it can get pretty aggressive too. For those who don't know, or who are living under a rock or whatever, Blue-Black Sakazuki right now has a start where it goes second, where it's like, all right, turn 1 brand new, look up for a, you know, grab a Hound Blaze or a Great Eruption, and then next turn, swing 7 with leader, -1 to the 3 costs you just played, Hound Blaze it off the board, swing 6 with brand new. Just insane amounts of aggression from a deck that's supposed to be more defensive and controlling. Because it also has tons of defensive and control elements in Borsalino and Sabo and Rebecca with all this. So it is a very high complexity deck. It's not simple at all. It is a very high complexity deck, but it does teeter on the edge between offensive and defensive. So I have it kind of in the middle here, believe it or not. And that might, like I said, that might be strange to some people, but take a look at where I put Rebecca, if that kind of puts things into perspective. And then last but not least, we have Red Purple Law. And guys, of course, these are all just my opinion. This is all just my opinion here, so y'all bear with me. Okay, red, purple Law's up last. For this, you know, for these what, 16 leaders we're looking at first here. We will look at a few others. I've got 8 others to look at, so, you know, let's get through this one. Red, purple Law, it kind of reminds me of Queen, where it's like, yeah, it's more complex than like just a, you know, a very simple deck like Katakuri, right? Or purple, or I don't even want to say purple Luffy. Purple Luffy probably should have been a little bit closer to the middle because of the way you have to manage your life and ramping. But like compared to like Zoro and Katakuri, you know, red, purple Law is much harder to play than that, obviously. But really, it's kind of like Queen, where like, yes, it's harder to play than your average deck, but that does not put it at the same level as like blue-black Rebecca for me, or red-green Law. I think is way harder to pilot. And the same thing with blue-black Sakazuki. So red-purple Law, I think, is fairly offensive. It's pretty aggressive, guys. Y'all know that. It probably could have been further over to the left. But it is on the more complex side. So realistically, maybe it should have been directly under Law right here, like maybe like right around here. But we'll take this for now. Okay, so that's where those are. Now, I'm going to talk about a few fan favorites real quick. I don't know why it took a second for the Magellan to pop in there. Y'all see that? Okay, now it's working. Maybe I'm just crazy. So let's look at, I have them highlighted in yellow here. Let's start at the bottom. Red, this is red starter Luffy, the ST01 Luffy. This is very simple, but it's not as simple as like Zoro, where you just attach it on and everything's plus 1,000. This one you have to do a little bit. It could even be closer towards the middle because of how Dawn manipulation works and getting full optimization out of that. So I have this as very offensive, typically, and again, guys, I know you can probably build this a lot closer to the middle here if you wanted to, but generally speaking, it does really shine with all the rush cards and the Straw Hat Crew stuff. So it's pretty offensive, generally speaking. Next up is Kid, Eustace Kid. I have this kind of just right in the middle here, where it's not the simplest deck to use, but it's also not super complex either. It really comes down to if you're running the film package, I think. I don't know. I've seen a bunch of different builds for Eustace Kid lately, and this is just green, you know, starter deck, Eustace Kid. So there's a few different ways to run this, but I'm just going to have it as more of the offensive side of things, because it can get very aggressive, the way it can double attack like Lucci can. But I feel like it's a little faster to the draw than Lucci is. Maybe that's just the green card pool. Honestly, thinking about it now, I think Eustace Kid probably could be closer towards the middle here, if I'm being completely honest. But either way, we'll just leave it there for now, because I can't really manipulate it in the slideshow. Crocodile, this is blue starter Crocodile. This deck is such an awesome representation of like what I would consider a true to style MTG mid-range deck, where you're just playing things on curve, but later in the game, it allows you to just kind of have answers and to outplay your opponent. It is more on the controlling side of things, that's for sure. And that's why I have it as, like, you know, pretty complex while being more defensive than it is aggressive. But I could see this being moved around, you know. I could see this changing. It all depends on the style of deck you're running. Are you running the Sentamaru package? What are you running in the deck? But generally speaking, the way the leader is, I do think it's a little harder to pilot than some of the other decks. And I do think it's a little bit slower than like a red or a green deck is, obviously. Right. And then last but not least, on this slide, we have blue and green Rosinante. Really interesting leader. I think the skill ceiling, I was talking to Joey about this over at Heart Pirates TCG. We both agree that this leader has a very high skill ceiling. It is a very complex deck to pilot properly, where you have to stay under 6 cards so you can stand up your leader, when to block with your leader versus when to let a character go. There are so many different factors involved, and it's the sky's the limits, right, when it comes to a deck like this, when it comes to complexity and how to pilot the deck properly. And like Queen, it's a very, very defensive list. It runs nothing but blockers, very big characters with 8-cost Eustace Kid, 10-cost Dofi. It's got all kinds of cool stuff going on. So really awesome, really, really cool stuff there. And then Magellan, we talked about a little bit earlier. It's kind of the more aggressive version of King, in my personal opinion, where they're not really the most complex decks to pilot. But at the same time, King builds a little higher, right, a little taller. And Magellan kind of stays a little closer to the ground, right? Kind of stays under 7 Dawn, if I'm not mistaken. Like, I think one of the most recent lists that I've looked at has the 7 cost Eustace Kid as the biggest character in the deck. So, interesting stuff there. Okay, and then I think this is the last slide here. This is just kind of a prediction one for some leaders coming out. And of course, I didn't do every single leader, guys. I'm just kind of showing you my thoughts and my opinions on this. And I really want to know what y'all have to think about it. So real quick, let me go over this and we'll talk a little more about it. I'll start down the bottom left again. Yellow-green Yamato or Yamato, whatever, is just double attack, just run your opponent over, just all to the face, just smash him, and then end on like Hody Jones. So, I mean, technically this maybe could have been a little closer to here, you know, towards the middle. But this is an aggressive deck, guys. Like, rushers, triggers out of life that can just run your opponent over as well. Very, very aggressive deck coming out of OP06. Okay, up here, let's go to Raiju. This was kind of hard to say because, generally speaking, I don't think... yeah, I've talked to a good player about this, and I don't think... you're supposed to play aggressive with this leader, so to speak, but it still kind of comes across as aggressive when playing against it. Now, yes, it's loading up, right, to just run you over. You guys see what I'm saying? And if you don't, guys, if you don't know anything about OP06, I understand. You can skip this part of the video. I totally get that. You know, we're still like 2 months away, 3 months away from this stuff. But Raiju is... it has this ability to kind of cheat cards into play that are way too expensive for what you're paying for them, which gives it more of an offensive feel because one of the cards literally has rush. But it's still more on the complicated side, and it could probably be as far up as here. I still think it's a little less complicated than something like, you know, Red Green Law, Blue Black Rebecca, and Sakazuki. But I think it's probably close to the level of Rosinante, but a little bit under Rosinante, because the leader effect literally just says, you know, if you have less Dawn than your opponent, draw a card, right? It's where the characters, or excuse me, if you have less Dawn than your opponent and you were to draw a card, and you were to return a Dawn this turn, draw a card. I completely butchered that, guys. I do apologize. I'm going to read the card verbatim real quick, and then we'll get back into it. Your turn, once per turn, when a Dawn card on your field is returned to your Dawn deck, draw 1 card. So it's just once a turn. But that's not really complicated, right? You just draw the card. And the characters, again, not super complicated. So it probably could be even lower on the complexity chart, but it still has, like, it's still more, takes a little more to pilot properly than some of the other decks do. Okay, let's move on. Gecko Moria. Gecko Moria is, I don't even know yet. I've seen so many different style lists for this leader. They're all roughly the same. But it's kind of like this mid-range deck. That's why I have it like right in the center in between offensive and defense. But sometimes it gets really aggressive, but then sometimes it gets real outlasty. It has the ability to kind of switch on and off, you know, as needed. Hey guys, this is definitely more on the complex side because of how you're having to generate the value from your trash. When should you use the leader effect versus when should you not? When should you trash a card, in other words, and whatnot. There's a lot going on there. And there's even times where it's like, when should I use my Perona? The 4-cost 2K counter Perona that makes your opponent trash a card if they have 5 cards or more in their hand. When should I use that versus when should I sit on that as a 2K counter? And, you know, something like, when should I use Hogback to start generating value versus, you know, whatever else. So very good stuff there. Looking forward to trying this deck out quite a bit. And then lastly, we have Perona. I'm looking more at this. The more I look at this, guys, it probably should be under in the green area here. I don't think this is the most complex deck. That's why I had it just like in the lower parts of blue. But, you know, again, looking at it, you can look at these things all day and drive yourself crazy, right? Because you might think of like, well, this version of the deck is this way. But generally speaking, it probably should be like right around here, where it's not exactly an offensive deck, even though you can tap down their characters, you know, as soon as turn 1 and 2 and start going at them, right? Or turn 2, I guess. As soon as turn 2, if they played something, you can just tap it down with your Perona and run it over, right? That's kind of the logic there, where it's kind of more on the aggressive side. But it definitely wants to build more into the mid game and moving into the late game with the more defensive stuff. Very powerful. It has lots of tools at its disposal, but I think I put it a little too high on complexity. It probably should be right around here or under. All right, guys. I think, yeah, that's it. I really want to know what you guys think. What did y'all think about this style of the video? And again, we have to give credit where it's due. That looks really cool, doesn't it? Very cool. Again, big shout out to the Small Hat crew. They came out with this video, and they went through every single leader, guys. Y'all go check them out and tell them what y'all think about where stuff should be, you know. And guys, please do not misunderstand this video. This was not me trying to say, hey, I'll do a better version than them. Nope, it's not. It's not that. It's not like that at all. This was their version that they came up with, and I just had a slightly different version like this. Just really cool stuff. I love theory crafting. When I first saw the video, I knew right away, like when I saw their video and I saw this, I hadn't seen anything of where the leaders were. I was just like, man, I want to do something like this soon, and I want to make it my own style, blah, 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 and here's where we are. And y'all see, I changed mine quite a bit. See how they have red and green at the top? That goes into purple and blue. Mine's basically totally, almost total opposite, where purple and blue are up top, red and green are bottom. Offense for Steve. Y'all already explained it. Right, guys, let's watch this little thing real quick. Very cool. And I really want to know what you guys have to say about this. Any comments, questions, suggestions, please put them down below. And, yeah, hope you guys enjoyed. Until next time, guys, peace.